first. What is most likely? Short-term spending bill, national emergency, or another government shutdown?
We could get some mix of at least two of those. I don't think a short-term spending bill is likely. The president and the Republicans have shown very little appetite for another episode of kicking the can down the road. The president really wants to make a decision about what he does about the wall as soon as possible. I think we very well could see some sort of national emergency or some sort of presidential move to repurpose money that has already been appropriated. We heard from President Trump's acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, over the weekend saying that they've already identified billions of dollars in the budget that they think that they can move around. Some of it they can move without a national emergency, and some of it they can move with a national emergency. So I think it's likely that we'll see that at some point, but we are very much at risk of another government shutdown. The president is not likely to sign a bill that does not include billions of dollars for a border wall, and that includes Democratic moves on restricting detention beds. The president has already sort of drawn a red line in the sand over that. So we're very likely to see another government shutdown if the Democrats and Republicans cannot come to some sort of compromise over those two provisions in the next few hours.
Christine, I want to say on that, because the president has had dwindling support on the wall. But let's talk about this new bed issue, because Democrats clearly had public opinion on their side during the shutdown. Is it a risk to throw in this last-minute demand to limit the amounts of beds in detention centers? Because doesn't it play into the argument that the president likes to make that Democrats are supporting undocumented immigrants?
Well, I think it is a risk, right? And any time you add a new thing in the final week of negotiations, it's a risk. There's no question.
Then why do it?
Because I think it's the right thing to do. And I think
whom?
For the community of undocumented immigrants that we're talking about here. Look, I think there's a logistical and then more of a moral issue. We know that they didn't have enough bed space for any of the families and children when they began ripping children from their mothers. So there is a size space we have to deal with here. And as we saw during that crisis, it's not like you can just put up appropriate places for people to be detained. So that's real. Two, this idea of focusing ICE on only deporting people who are violent criminals is not a new idea in the United States.
But we're talking about all of these government workers who could potentially, if we have a shutdown, they're not getting paid again. Is it the smart, in terms of risk management, like theoretically, I completely understand the point that you're making, but in terms of democratic risk management, is it the right move for them to make this argument at the moment when we could face another shutdown? That's 800,000 people.
Today's Monday.
Great point.
Today's Monday, and the deadline is, Friday at midnight. That's a long time for things to go up and down.
It's not.
And this is also, this kind of stalemate we're at right now. I've seen many a deal go to dead on a Monday and be alive by Friday. So I don't think in risk management they've stepped over the line at all.
Well, here's the thing. We could have an agreement with the White House, Republicans and Democrats, where they're all in cahoots and say, this is the perfect deal. It still takes time to pass it. It takes several days. So we should have had an agreement to be able to get it on the legislative calendar and passed in the House and the Senate and then signed by the president by the end of the weekend. Now we're running into the clock. We're in overtime at this point. There's still the logistics of passing the bill, and we don't even have an agreement. If they don't have an agreement by tomorrow, we're probably going to get some form of a shutdown, and that's a huge problem. And I think there's also something going on right now. Democrats didn't cause the first shutdown, but this shutdown, I think there's a sliver of the American electorate, the voters who in 2010 said we're going to change the House's majority back to Republicans, who in 2014 said we're going to change the Senate majority back to Republicans, in 2016 voted for Donald Trump, and in 2018 voted for Democrats in the House because they're tired of Washington not working. And they see this and how Democrats and Republicans are once again at a stalemate. They're just saying, you know what? All the bums are two sides of the same coin, and while we might not vote for Republicans or Donald Trump in 2020, we'll certainly sit out, which will hurt Democrats and Democratic presidential nominees.
Look, I think we have to, at this point and other points, hopefully stop running everything through the prism of the impact on the next election. This is an important bipartisan committee with good people, on both sides, by all accounts of how they stack up as legislators. And we need to air the issues that need to be aired, because otherwise we're going to be back here in 2 months or whatever. And the Democrats and the Republicans, whatever their perspective is on the wall, need to raise those in these negotiations and see what is the closest compromise that that makes everyone a little unhappy that we can get to. And to not raise those issues that are out there is an injustice to the process.
But it's not through the prism of the next election. It's the prism through the elections of the past. The voters have spoken and said, we want government to work, and here's the message we're sending you. And we're hearing and we're seeing that the Congress is completely deaf to that message. And that's very frustrating as an American that our Washington is broken.
We are not seeing that they're deaf to that. We're seeing a bipartisan committee have negotiations and be more forward-moving than any of the other structures that have been put in place over the past months to deal with this issue. Bipartisan committees are where issues get raised and get flushed out, and some get moved forward and some don't. And although you're right, you have to have time to get legislation passed, things can always be sped up. So Americans should not panic because we're at an issue where there is an agreement on Monday.
We also have to remember, if we go into another shutdown, detention beds are part of it, but the wall remains the primary reason why we will go into shutdown.
Because we have no idea if the president would accept what had come, where they were heading before we got to this detention bed issue. It's not like the president's publicly said, yes, he'll take that. So that's still a real question, too.
Toulouse, the White House could not handle, I shouldn't say couldn't handle, the public pressure became too much in the last government shutdown, and they found a way to have this short-term solution. But the president didn't get anything out of it. What gives this White House confidence that they could withstand the public pressure this time?
I don't think they are looking towards a long, lengthy government shutdown like the last time. I think the president has said that he set the table with the last shutdown for what he ultimately wants to do, which is a national emergency. I think we're looking at a situation where the president may accept much less for the wall than he normally would wish for out of these negotiations, and then decide to just go ahead and declare the national emergency anyway, repurpose money anyway, and really sort of stick a finger in the face of Congress after taking money that they appropriate. So that's something that the president is considering, and I think that might help avert a long-term, lengthy, month-long government shutdown like we saw the first time around. I think now they're looking at Plan B and Plan C, and that even if Democrats and Republicans come up with a deal that has much less money than what the president wants, he can just take money from other parts of the budget, and obviously Republicans and Democrats will not be happy about that, having their negotiations undercut with this new spending from elsewhere in the budget. But that's what the president is looking to do, and that's one way he could keep from having a long-term government shutdown that really blows back on the White House and tanks the president's poll numbers, as we saw back in January.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.